I watched 100 movies in 2024, so I decided to rank them. Now for a little background, the 2020s have not been the best year for movies, in my opinion. Because of COVID and a few other factors, 2020 through 2022 was a very rough time for movies. Now, we did get a couple of gems hidden in there, but generally it wasn't like 2019 where it seemed like every month there was a must-see film. 2023, on the other hand, seemed to be a return to form in some ways. We had so many great films like Godzilla Minus One, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Killers of the Flower Moon, Suzume, John Wick 4, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, The Boy and the Heron, and so many more. With that great momentum from 2023, you would think that 2024 would at least be a decent year for films. But between the writer's strike last year and a few other effects, 2024 ended up being a pretty weak year for film. But on the other hand, I like watching bad and mediocre movies too, so I didn't have any shortage of that to watch this year. With that being said, let's start off this ranking from worst to best of the 100 films that I watched in 2024. Starting with Gracie and Pedro ended up being the worst movie that I saw this year. It's one of those movies that just feels like it doesn't work on a fundamental and rudimentary level. It's kind of comparable to other animated movies like Norm of the North or Ratatouille, where it feels like every single aspect of it didn't have much thought or consideration for how it would be put into place. The only thought behind it is, how do we get some slop out the door to amuse kids for an hour and a half? The animation is very ugly. I have no clue how this got released in theaters, and it has the typical trappings of a lot of really bad kids movies with its humor. There's plenty of fart and burp jokes, but there's also a lot of attempts to appeal to what the writers believe is the modern child. So the basic plot of this movie is that a cat and a dog get separated from their family whenever they're traveling, and they have to find their way home. They end up getting lost on a flight, and there is a solid chunk of the movie that is dedicated to the two kids who are very upset about this, making a diss track against the flight company, which goes viral and makes the CEO go insane. Oh yeah, and the songs in this are really hard to listen to. Overall, this is the worst movie I saw this year just because it feels so soulless in a lot of ways. It's just a miserable movie to sit through, all things considered. It's just terrible. Don't watch it. As a longtime SpongeBob fan, I was very surprised whenever I saw the reviews for this movie were so low. And this was even before it officially released. This was when it was leaked a while back. Now, I am pretty accustomed to some pretty terrible SpongeBob content. I grew up whenever seasons 6, 7, and 8 were airing and was actively watching it. And though I knew it was not nearly as good as those original 3 seasons, or even the first 5 seasons, I still enjoyed it to a certain extent. Even the 2 most recent theatrical movies, I still enjoyed quite a bit. SpongeBob Out of Water was definitely better than the third one, but they both had some merit to them. So I was really surprised whenever this one was getting completely clowned on. But whenever I watched it, I realized why. The biggest issue with this movie is that it is painfully unfunny. I can remember like one joke that was amusing, not even entertaining or funny, just amusing in the entire film. Sandy as the protagonist isn't necessarily a bad idea, but she's so underutilized in pretty much every aspect of this movie. Her family adds nothing to the plot, and it was just painful to watch whenever any of the human actors were on the screen. This movie is about the worst SpongeBob content I've ever personally seen, which is kind of surprising. I had a theory going for a while there that Nickelodeon purposely made this movie terrible and gave it to Netflix so that Paramount Plus would look better in comparison. Megamind 2 is a really disappointing sequel if you actually consider it a sequel to the original, but to be honest, there's not much to say about this movie. The animation is terrible, the voice acting's a downgrade, the story is awful, the characters are just a shell of their former selves, and there's really nothing here for Megamind fans. There's just nothing much to talk about here. It's just a boring and dull and lifeless and disappointing movie. The American Society... No, wait, let me see if I got that title right. It's the American Society of Magical... And then I can't say that last word. I'm not going to. The poster's on the screen here, you can read it for yourself, but I'm not going to say that. It's a movie with an honestly kind of intriguing and funny premise that is completely wasted the whole way through. Don't get me wrong, the trailer for this looked abysmal. It looked like it was going to be super politically pushing towards one way and focusing on making that message more important than actually making a good movie. Turns out the opposite is true. It didn't say anything and focused on saying nothing instead of being a good movie. This film seems like it should be funnier than it actually is, but scenes just seem to meander on and on and on with no purpose, no point, nothing to say, nothing to do. The guy from Detective Pikachu, who is the lead actor in this, is abysmal in this role. He has no emotions, no life with anything he says or anything he does. There's a romance in this movie that I would be hard pressed to find anybody who felt anything during it, because there's no chemistry between any of the characters. None of the dialogue feels natural. Nothing about this movie feels like it works. It's so boring. Whenever I watched this movie on a Saturday afternoon, there were about 4 people in the theater whenever I got there, and by the hour mark, I was the only person left there. Everybody had walked out except for me. Then about 10 minutes before the movie ended, a few people came in looking for a different movie, and I told them, guys, look, you don't want to see this, get out while you still can. A disclosure that I need to give right now before going any further into this list is that I'm not a big fan of horror movies. I just never really got the appeal of them. I'm not really scared by those type of things, and they produce such a negative emotion of awful stuff without any real light at the end of the tunnel often to cling to. Now, I like dark movies or movies with sad themes. Something like Grave of the Fireflies might be something that is more disturbing or upsetting than a typical horror movie. But for that, it feels like it has a purpose in portraying a message there. The purpose of the movie, by showing you all this grisly images and these sad themes, is to show you that war is something that is not good. A horror movie, on the other hand, in its most typical form, the only real thing that you're going to get out of it is scared. So if I don't like that negative emotion of being scared, then there's nothing left for me. With that being said, Latency is still a terrible movie. It may not be as bad for somebody who likes horror movies, but to me, it was nearly unbearable. The film revolves around a girl who gets this headset, which basically makes her input for gaming have no delay. The movie tries to be surreal, but it just comes off as confusing, and not like the writers had a plan in mind for the beginning, but just kept throwing stuff at the wall till the movie was finished. I remember at the beginning of the movie, one of the things in the opening credits was it listed the composer of the music of the film, but literally, I could be wrong on this, but the only song I heard during the entire runtime was a really crappy remix of the Tetris theme.
It's exactly the same as sleep as it is when I'm awake.
This movie's biggest flaw is that it's just so boring the whole way through. There's barely any scares, there's not really much interesting concepts between the initial setup, the characters aren't very likable, and it is abysmally paced. The best part of this movie-going experience was that whenever I was in the theater, the guy in front of me about gave up 10 minutes into this movie, so the rest of the runtime, he was just on his phone checking a baseball game and looking up trucks online. And honestly, about the halfway point of the film, I started looking at his phone more than the actual big screen in front of me. When I met you in the summer. Summer Camp is one of those really difficult movies to stomach. It's a comedy in the very loosest terms. Basically, the whole concept of it is that 3 old women go back to a summer camp that they enjoyed as kids, and they're trying to relive the glory days of whenever they were younger. Imagine 80 for Brady, except somehow even worse. Like, in comparison, 80 for Brady looks like Citizen Kane. This movie has so many jokes where the punchline is, oh, look at these old ladies doing something that old ladies shouldn't be doing. And that's all the humor to the movie. The only redeeming element that makes it a little bit better than some of the other films on this list is Josh Peck. He randomly shows up at random intervals in the movie, and the first time that he did, I heard a random person in the back of my theater start to choke on his pop. Monster Summer is yet another summer-themed movie, except instead of the problems of the last one where it was just super unfunny in every turn, this one's super boring at every turn. It doesn't have the issue of the overbearing jokes like the last one, but every single thing that the characters do feels like it's of little to no consequence. Scenes just happen so that there's something on the screen. We feel no character development, no growth, no stakes, no nothing. It's just an hour and a half of kids meandering on this summer town. Afraid is one of those horror movies that would have been a lot more fun if I saw it with my friends. This movie uses the concept of AI to drive its plot, but also drive its low budget. There are so many sequences in here that are just AI art, they're AI generated images in the place of something actually interesting, which for one takes you out of it, but 2 shows a big sign of laziness. But beyond that, this is a horror movie with like 2 jump scares and nothing else even slightly creepy in it. The AI in this causes no urgency at all, and in the end the AI comes back and you start to wonder what the whole point of the climax was. The basic premise is that there's this advanced AI that comes into this one family's house, but they do a good job of characterizing this AI as evil. In one scene, they tell the parents that they're going to show the kids a nature documentary, but it just shows them the Emoji Movie instead.
He was in the Amazon with my mom when she was researching spiders right before she died.
Madam Web is the best movie ever made.
Let's leave!
But the door is locked, and the only way out is through the perfume department.
The new Mean Girls movie has already been ripped to shreds, and you probably know already why it's terrible. The acting is awful, the songs are absolutely atrocious, the pacing is all weird, all the changes that they made to the original just make it worse in comparison. And it's honestly the equivalent to a Disney live-action remake like The Lion King, where it's just new and different for the sake of being new and different, without adding anything artistically that the original doesn't already offer. The Twisters, which is not to be confused with the movie Twisters, which we will get into later on this list, is a mockbuster of that film. Which, if you don't know, a mockbuster is essentially just a ripoff that's trying to capitalize on the success of another film. And it's basically what you would expect. It's basically an hour and a half of nonsense science talk and like 2 action scenes that are completely green screen with the worst CGI you've seen in your life. It's like Sharknado, except boring, and with a lower budget, and with another charm, and another camp. And it's a rip-off of another film, so that degrades it too. Just watch Twisters instead. The Borderlands movie is really terrible, but I think it's not quite as bad as everybody was saying. My biggest issue with the movie is that it is just really difficult to look at. The color scheming, the costume design, the way that it's shot just makes me feel a little nauseous inside. The casting in this is really bad. The actors don't do a great job either, but part of the reason for that is because they don't fit the roles that they're cast for. Jack Black should, in theory, work well as Claptrap, but that's about the only one that makes sense. But his character ends up probably being the worst of the whole film because all of the jokes that he tries to say are just never funny and just really annoying. One of the biggest issues with the casting is that everybody just looks way too old for the characters they're playing. It also doesn't help that the movie is never funny and the plot is never really that investing. The action is pretty terrible and the pacing isn't great either, but I do think there is some mild fun possibly to be had here. There are a couple scenes that, even though they're a little difficult to look at, do have some fun set pieces in them. And the writing is only terrible about 85% of the time instead of 100% of the time. Still a terrible movie, but not quite as bad as everybody was saying.
A level 4 naughty lister?
There's a lot of issues with Red 1, but the biggest one that I have is it feels like one of the most soulless movies ever created. Every single decision that was made about this film feels like it was made by a marketing team instead of a group of creatives. The casting obviously shows that it's not really for who would best fit these characters, it's who would be best to put on the poster of this movie. The Rock is really bad as his character. The comedy is pretty terrible all around. But the biggest issue with this movie is that it just feels soulless. Every single joke in this just feels derivative of what's been popular through the MCU's comedy for the past 15 years. Every single emotional beat just feels derivative of other modern blockbusters or the classic Christmas movies, but without any of the real intention or thoughtfulness from the characters put into it. It very much is a streaming movie in many ways. It's not one that feels like it's been made to be consumed where the movie is the sole thing that you're focusing on. Which for a movie, especially one that's released in theaters, is a pretty bad thing. It feels like one that you should be looking on your phone during. The comedy is terrible, the pacing is awful, the CGI is really bad. It's just a difficult movie to get through, and the biggest thing for it is it feels like it doesn't have any of the good intents that it claims to have by being a Christmas movie. It feels completely like it's built on the corporate side of Christmas instead of the caring side of Christmas. Though that sounds really cheesy.
Come with me, and you'll be in the world of your imagination.
Imaginary is yet another Blumhouse bore. The concept does sound somewhat interesting at first, that the imaginary friend of this little girl is secretly something evil. But the movie doesn't really do anything with this until the last 30 minutes. Until we do get to this imaginary world, we're stuck in the real one, where it feels like it crawls at a snail's pace. The scares aren't scary whatsoever, the characters are bland, the dialogue is really annoying. The first hour is just really boring. This movie does pick up a little bit in the last 30 minutes, minutes whenever they do go to the imaginary world, but even then, it's still not really good at all. They create this world that's supposed to be the pinnacle of imagination, but all it looks like is a Motel 6 with some cotton clouds in the sky and a blue tint to everything. The only good part of this movie-going experience was a single scene in the movie. At one point, the teenage girl in the movie is pining over this boy, and she invites him over while the mom is gone. Now, the boy is supposed to be a bad influence, and whenever he comes over, he holds up a Ziploc bag full of pills, and it's implied that it's some sort of drugs that they're going to take together. But eventually, the boy gets his just desserts and is scared by the imaginary friend. In a later scene in the movie, the moms of the two children are talking to each other, and the one's really upset, saying that the boy tried to come over here and give drugs to her girl. But the mom holds up the drugs that are found, and the other mom says, "Oh, those are just my allergy pills." And right after that happened, somebody in my theater who was clearly on some sort of drugs just started bursting out laughing for a good probably 30 to 60 seconds. And his laughter was so infectious that everybody who was just sitting there bored in the theater couldn't help but laughing with him.
Hey, look at this minion car. It's a minion car. Banana.
It's a yellow car!
Despicable Me 4 feels like the most lifeless movie in the franchise if you don't count Minions. Now, I actually quite like the first two Despicable Me movies, and the third one is passable. The Minions movie is really bad, but Minions 2 was surprisingly good. But this movie feels like it didn't have anything to do. The biggest problem is they didn't really have any idea for where would be interesting to take these characters, or what would be a fascinating story to explore in this world. It felt like they were just rushed to come up with some sort of plot to meet a deadline, so they just threw whatever they had against the wall and see what stuck. And it's kind of disappointing that these later movies don't involve some of the best characters in the series, like Dr. Nefario and the mom. The movie really isn't funny, and the plot isn't that cohesive. It feels kind of like the third one, except worse, where a lot of it is just all these different subplots that kind of come crashing together at the end. The villain is forgettable. It feels like it doesn't have anywhere interesting to take these characters. It just feels like kid slop through and through. The animation is still decent, and there's still an okay line once in a while from these characters that remind us why we may have liked them in the first place. But overall, it just feels like just a studio mandated film and nothing else. No creative juice behind it whatsoever. Which, I mean, what can you really expect from Despicable Me 4? But at the same time, this is a major Hollywood movie that made close to $1 billion. It feels like there should have been something more to it. Some more time in the oven, some interesting story to tell, but there isn't. Kraven the Hunter is a movie that shouldn't work. While compared to Madame Web, this movie is technically better. There are just so many scenes in Madame Web that stuck with me, while Kraven the Hunter, basically nothing feels like it has any lasting value. I remember so many scenes from Madame Web, like the one with the balloons popping where they couldn't name drop Peter Parker, the one on the train where the same thing happened over and over and over again, that stupid scene with the bird, the ridiculous last act, and the stupid Pepsi product placement. Kraven the Hunter doesn't have as many issues as Madame Web and is technically a better made film, but it's not nearly as funny to watch as Madame Web. Aaron Taylor Johnson tries, kind of, and not really anyone else does. The movie is horribly paced. We don't get into the second act of the film until the movie is already halfway over. The attempts to try to shove in the Marvel references, especially ones like the Rhino and the Chameleon, feel very corporate in how they're incorporated. But this movie does have a bright side. It marks the end of the Sony Spider-Man villain universe, hopefully, and if you ask me, this is the perfect movie to go out with. Mediocre, bad, boring, poorly made, just pure slop, everything that this universe strives to be. Next, we have a collection of 3 movies that I like to call the Bohr trilogy of movies. They're movies where, from a technical level, there is competence there, but whether it be the story or the characters, they just fall flat and are completely boring to watch. The first one and the worst of these is ISS. And yeah, it's boring. It's a movie that has an inherently interesting concept, though a bit derivative of some other media. Namely, I saw a lot of comparisons to the general idea of Among Us, which in of itself is derivative of a lot of other media, but it is done in a way where the tension is not felt whatsoever and you really don't care for any of the characters. It feels like we're just slowly floating in the ISS for an hour and a half, where nothing is happening, where these characters make stupid decisions, where most of it is just Span thinking and talking, but not in a way that engages the audience or makes the audience think, but in a way where you're just waiting for the next scene to happen. Unlike all these three movies, because of that, it feels like the whole point of the movie is just waiting for it to end, which for a piece of entertainment that's supposed to help you escape that you should want to watch instead of living your normal life is a pretty disappointing thing.
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
Lost on a Mountain in Maine is a movie with a way too complicated title, but also falls into the similar category of just being a boring film. The movie has a certain level of intrigue that ISS doesn't carry, but it goes on for way too long without enough really changing or happening. It's pretty well shot and directed, minus the pacing issue, and I do appreciate the use of some documentary elements like interviews, kind of similar to the intro of Interstellar, but the movie at a certain point just loses all interest for me and just becomes completely boring and monotonous. It again just feels like we're dragging on from scene to scene to get to a point where we know what's going to happen at the end, and it's just taking its time, not in a way that makes us absorbed into the world or more interested in the characters, but just makes us wait for it to end. It's kind of hard to hate this movie because it does feel like it has quite a bit of passion put into it, but it's so boring that it's really difficult to get through. Bonhoeffer is the third film in our trilogy of Borefest, and in a way it's the best made one, but in a way it's the most disappointing one, because the life and story of Bonhoeffer is one that is inherently interesting. There are so many stories and so many perspectives that you could go for this movie where it is genuinely engaging and interesting. Even with the Christian aspect, I feel like that could easily add to the intrigue. Not necessarily as a piece of propaganda, though the message of the gospel could be spread that way, but through using the common ideas of the characterization of what a Christian is or what a Christian should be doing to challenge some of the interesting events that were going on in World War II. This movie doesn't really decide to focus on that though, aside from a couple of scenes. It's really sad that this movie is historically inaccurate, yet based on such an interesting life. It makes it so confusing why it was made like that. It's yet another one where it feels like we're just going from scene to scene to get to the obligatory ending. But what makes this one even worse is that it's told out of chronological order, reminiscent of something like a Christopher Nolan film. Except instead of it being done with some sort of purpose to enhance the narrative or give us a character's perspective that we may not have thought of before, it feels like it's done like that just to copy a popular gimmick. It makes the plot more confusing and less interesting and worse paced instead of enhancing the experience. The acting is whatever, the pacing is the biggest issue. This movie is way too long. Now, a movie about Bonhoeffer could easily justify that runtime, but it doesn't include enough interesting things to justify that. Why this one is ranked higher than the last two though, is because it does still maintain a hint of that interesting life that Bonhoeffer lived. There are a couple of scenes that are intriguing, not really because of how they're presented in the movie, but because of the implications of the real life historical events. Overall, a big missed opportunity and way more boring than it has any right to be. Between the Temples may not objectively be as bad as I'm ranking it, but my personal experience and the way that I feel about it kind of puts it here. It's a comedy that really doesn't appeal to my sense of taste and humor, and that's an objective criticism of it, because this movie is probably pretty good if you jive with its sense of humor, but I didn't, so it made it really uncomfortable and difficult to go through. It's a cringe movie that thrives on the drawing out of these scenes and having these characters' weird dialogue draw on and on in these very uncomfortable situations. This movie's comedic scenes were ones that were the most difficult for me to get through for a very subjective and kind of stupid reason. A lot of them take place at dinner tables during meals, and the sound of chewing, especially in a theater, is very palpable. But for someone like me who really gets annoyed and almost hurts to listen to people eat food, it was a really difficult movie to stomach. All the performances were good. The story was somewhat unexpected in a lot of ways. But if you can't jive with its sense of comedy, and especially if you're sensitive to the sound of people eating, then it is an extremely difficult and unpleasant movie to get through. Which for some people may be why they would enjoy it, but for me personally, it just made it really difficult. The Forge is another Christian movie from the people who brought you movies like Fireproof, War Room, and Courageous. But the movie's biggest flaw is one that it shares with all of those films. It puts the message as a priority over a movie. It's an issue with a lot of movies, especially more recently. And it doesn't matter what agenda they're pushing, Christian or not. If the message is more important than the movie you're making, then I feel like you're missing the idea of filmmaking on a fundamental level. Not that I'm one to talk, but it certainly detracts a lot. Though to the movie's credit, one of its best elements is that its message is one that I think is pretty valuable, both for those who are Christians, but also the secular world too. It's one of the importance of mentorship and discipleship. Though the message itself is good, the way that it's presented and portrayed is far from it. The movie takes the typical Christian strides of having a character go from the worst person ever to the best person ever in the span of 2 minutes. Some of the things that he does whenever he doesn't know Christ is comedically stupid, and some of the stuff that he does after he knows Christ is comedically saintly. For a movie that's so focused on the message, all of these movies have so much trouble actually portraying a character that is a realistic portrayal of somebody who receives and lives out these messages. Because it's not something that's just a simple flip or something that happens over the span of a couple days. If you were truly to come to Christ or apply any of the messages of these films, it's something that involves a lot of struggle, a lot of pain, a lot of messing up, and a lot of difficulties on the way. But these movies seem to make the message more appealing with sacrificing realism. This movie has a lot of mom energy coming from it, though they probably realize at this point that's their primary target for all of these movies. The comedy is terrible, the characters' decisions seem irrational, whether irrationally evil or irrationally good. Not that the good stuff is irrational to do, but the way that it's shown seems very unrealistic. And there's a few issues with the moral too, in a way. One of the big things of the movie is that the main kid is hanging out with these other kids who are not being a good influence on him, who are encouraging him to do bad things. And throughout the movie, he's cleaning up and getting rid of all these things that his mentor is suggesting, like throwing away all of his video games or cleaning his room. But the negative influence of his friends is never really addressed, which is an odd thing to overlook. Either way, this movie isn't quite as boring as some of those others, but its preachiness gets in the way of it being a competent movie. I'll give it props for its message being okay, but even the way that's presented is heavily flawed. But even in its awfulness, it's still a lot more entertaining than a lot of the movies below it.
Hello, how are you? I am under the water. Please help me. Here too much raining.
Night Swim is the third of the 3 really bad Blumhouse movies that I saw this year, but it's easily the best one for one reason only. It's not nearly as boring as the other 2. This movie is really stupid, the characters do a lot of stupid things, it's not shot well, it's not scary whatsoever, but at least it's funny bad at a lot of points. The concept of a haunted swimming pool in of itself is so ridiculous that even if it's not executed the best, there is still some comedic value to it. Don't get me wrong, it's still a terrible movie, but it's at least one that you can get some enjoyment on if you're riffing on it with friends. Here is Robert Zemeckis' newest movie, and if I was asked to describe it very briefly, I would say it's derivative. It feels very derivative of Forrest Gump mostly. A lot of its marketing campaign is the return of the actors, like Tom Hanks returning to work with Robert Zemeckis again on a movie that spans a long period of time. Now, Forrest Gump isn't my favorite either, but it's much better than this movie. The big gimmick of it is that the camera is set in one place and it doesn't move. And it's basically this one shot through the entirety of history, starting from the dinosaurs and all that stuff going to modern day and even the near future. The issue with it is that it has a lot of plots that it tries to juggle alongside the main one with Tom Hanks. but a lot of them feel underdeveloped and not well utilized. The way that Ready Player One felt like a film where they threw a lot of characters and references in just so the audience can point it at and say, I know that, is a similar issue to what this movie faces. There's a lot of scenes that take place in the past where they name drop or have these caricatures of these famous people of history. Not really to add to the point at all, but just for people to point at and say, hey, I know that person. The main plot with Tom Hanks and Robin Wright does feel very boring at a lot of points, and it seems to drag on. It's supposed to be a little more realistic portrayal of what might go on a family house from year to year, but I don't know if it's the acting or the script or what, but most of it just felt so unengaging. The singular camera angle sounds like an interesting twist on how to shoot a movie at first, but it feels like a gimmick and a hindrance more than anything else. It's kind of like a lot of games on the Wii. The Wii was famous for its motion controls, and that is a gimmick in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of games that used it well. A game like Wii Sports was enhanced by the use of motion controls. It was a gimmick, but it felt like it was built around it in a lot of ways. But there was like a lot of shovelware. Games like this feel like they were using the gimmick of the Wii as a crutch more than anything else. And that's what this movie's gimmick feels like. It feels like a crutch to stand out rather than a genuine artistic decision to help enhance the story. That may not be what it was originally intended to be, but that's how it felt like it came out in the end product. Hit Pig is another pretty bad animated movie, but this one is much better than all the ones at the bottom of the list for a singular reason. It has big crackhead energy. This movie, like the ones at the bottom of the list, all feature jokes and plots that feel very childish and derivative. But this one has very strange and bizarre characters and situations, and a sense of humor that falls flat a majority of the times, but does actually hit here and there. This movie tries to make you care about the main characters and the emotional beat to the story, but that's virtually impossible. But it at least takes the plot in a somewhat interesting direction by the end, pulling a Mario Galaxy and just saying, forget it, we're going to space. Probably the best part of the movie was Dwight Schrute playing the villain from Monsters vs. Aliens again, except as a human this time. He wasn't genuinely funny, but there is a certain ironic sense of joy that I got from it. And that's what I could say about a lot of this movie. There is an ironic sense of joy to be found in it. It is objectively pretty bad, but kind of similar to a movie like Open Season Scared Silly. There is so much lunacy, not in an artistic way, but more like Instagram Reels, where at a certain point you just need to turn off your brain and absorb for a second everything that you're being fed, before immediately turning it off and asking yourself, what did I just watch?
Am I glad he's frozen in there and that we're out here and that he's the sheriff and that we're frozen out here and that we're in there and I just remembered we're out here. What I want to know is where's the caveman?
Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, similarly to Red One, is a movie that feels completely void of soul. However, at least this one does have a few decent moments and doesn't feel quite as derivative as that movie. We follow the cast from Ghostbusters Afterlife as they have yet another adventure, and there are way too many characters stuffed into this movie. A lot of the scenes are kind of amusing, where it's the equivalent of keys jingling in front of you. You are watching it and getting something, but nothing long term, nothing meaningful, nothing that is actually good. The only scene that I kind of enjoyed was the scene where Patton Oswalt explains some of the lore to the characters, but maybe that was just because half of it I was just closing my eyes and pretending I was watching Ratatouille instead. There's a lot of reference humor of the earlier films where it feels like it doesn't really have a point besides pointing it out and say, oh, do you understand that reference? Do you remember that movie? It's pretty bad and soulless, but not an infuriating kind. More in a, this is one of the most forgettable movies I've ever seen kind of ways.
No, don't like that.
If is one of those kids movies where I feel like if it was released in the 90s, people today would defend it, not being willing to listen to any criticism lodged towards it. The biggest problem with If is that it's really too boring and slow paced for kids, but it's also too childish and meandering for adults. The movie does have an intriguing premise starting out, but the way that I wanted the plot to go, or really any interesting way for the plot to go, didn't really happen until the last 30 minutes of the movie. It feels like the movie just kept spinning its wheels and adding all this filler instead of further exploring the interesting concept that it presents. The twist in the movie is extremely predictable. Some of the sadder themes like death are not handled particularly well. They're not handled in an offensive way, but they're handled in a way where you question why they were included in the movie if they weren't going to be taken with a certain seriousness to them. But in the same way, they are still taken too serious and really bring down the tone of the movie. It's a movie that just has too much and too little simultaneously. It tries too hard to be adult, but at the same time tries too hard to be kiddish. And because of that, it really doesn't succeed at either.
I know where you live.
The Garfield movie shows our fat, lasagna-loving cat back at it again. Now, there's never really been a Garfield theatrical movie that captures a lot of the essence of the Garfield characters or the Garfield story. A lot of it is forgettable. The jokes go on for way too long. The characters don't really feel like themselves, especially Garfield. Garfield in this movie feels way too excited and involved in everything. There's barely any John, there's no Normal, except for a credit scene. And it decides to focus on these new characters instead, which are quite frankly not very interesting. To be honest, one of the biggest issues with this movie is the product placement. It is egregious and feels like it happens on basically every turn. There's a scene where they get a lot of food delivered because delivery services like DoorDash need promotion. There's a scene where Garfield orders food through the Walmart app. There's a scene kind of like the Sonic movie where they talk about Olive Garden. And Olive Garden's never-ending pasta that's just starting at $11.99.
I thought you were like super famous or something.
One day you're throwing back pink lemonades on Diddy's yacht in Saint-Tropez. Ooh, jackpot!
Jackpot is yet another very soulless movie. This one does have some interesting action scenes, but its characters are very annoying. Awkwafina and John Cena play Awkwafina and John Cena yet again. The jokes are really not funny. The plot does have some initial intrigue, but it's lost fairly fast. All the twists in the movie you can see coming from a mile away. The shooting and direction is very flat and boring for a lot of it. Really, if it weren't for those half-decent action scenes, this movie would be much further down the list.
We're doing a sequel. We're back by popular demand. Come on, everybody, strike up the band.
Moana 2 is yet another Disney movie in a string of disappointing Disney movies. Now, I'd say this one is still better than Strange World and probably still better than Wish, but it feels a lot more lazy than those two. It's pretty well known at this point that this movie is essentially just 3 episodes of a canceled Disney Plus show that were just smushed together at the last minute, and it really shows. I'm not even a big fan of the first Moana movie, but watching this movie, it felt like it wasn't part of the same universe. You could really feel the disconnect between this film and the first one, in a similar way that you would feel a disconnect between the original film and the Disney straight-to-DVD sequel. Now, there definitely is still a lot more polished than any of those movies, but it still feels just as generic. It doesn't feel like a Disney movie. The songs in this are completely forgettable. The plot is completely forgettable. The characterization is completely forgettable. This movie in general is so forgettable. It's not offensively bad in any particular way, besides the corporate greed aspect of it. It really just doesn't feel like a movie. Demon Slayer to the Hashira Training was the Demon Slayer recap movie that came out this year, and is my first experience watching anything Demon Slayer, and to be quite frank, it'll probably be my last too. Now, I know this is a pretty bad place to jump in since it essentially is a recap movie of a season finale and a couple new episodes of the new season, and there were definitely elements to enjoy. The animation is a standout, and the action is very good, but what drove me up the wall was the characters and more specifically how over the top and obnoxious all of them felt. Now, granted, it is partially due to my own fault of not having gotten to know these characters, and maybe it's not as bad in some other parts of the series, but it felt like every emotional moment was completely ruined by them yelling and screaming something that maybe should have called for a more subtle portrayal of that emotion. It just felt like no matter what was happening, they had to scream their emotions, whether that was sadness or happiness or confusion or embarrassment. Everything felt like it had to be screamed or yelled. And that really annoying anime cliche just carried out through a lot of this movie. Most of the characters, it felt like, consistently did that, especially the main protagonist. Anytime anything happened, that seemed to be his emotion. And because of that, I felt like I couldn't enjoy anything that was going on. It was just very obnoxious and annoying. And because of that, I really have no motivation to watch the series. And this movie is pretty mid too.
Boys, I just got a call from a young man who sounded absolutely distressed. Can you head over and help him before he goes cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo?
Cuckoo is a horror movie that probably would be a lot more enjoyed if you were into horror movies. For me, it just felt like it didn't offer anything rather than that initial sense of creepiness around the whole thing. The characters weren't especially likable. The story had a few interesting things going on, but a lot of the times felt like it was just meandering. The performances were alright, the cinematography was decent. It just felt like, as a non-horror fan, there wasn't anything that stuck out to me, and because of that, it felt pretty middling.
And everybody knows that the sequel's never quite as good.
Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire is a mixed movie with a lot more bad than good. To give this movie its props, the action scenes are pretty good sometimes. I wasn't really impressed by anything in the first 2/3 of the movie, but the final action scene on the beach was actually really engaging. Now, was it worth it to sit through the whole rest of the movie to get there? Absolutely not. The way that this movie is best enjoyed is to look up that and maybe the monkey fight scene too on YouTube and just watch those clips. Everything that's not an action scene in this movie is extremely boring and tedious. The humor is incredibly unfunny, and the human characters are incredibly uninteresting. The movie looks pretty decent, but whenever you're spending a majority of your time with boring human characters with unfunny, cringy, and boring human dialogue, then a majority of the movie isn't going to be fun. Just because there is a couple of decent action scenes in it doesn't mean that it's worth it. Now, it's not really fair to compare this movie to Godzilla Minus One because they're going for extremely different tones, but I feel like it's even a downgrade compared to the movie that came out a few years ago, Godzilla vs. Kong. Though that movie also suffered a lot from boring human characters and really unfunny human dialogue, it felt like it had a lot more interesting action scenes, and they were a lot more frequent too. I Saw the TV Glow is a movie that really just didn't click with me. After seeing the trailer, I was really excited for it, but that probably also was one of the reasons why I found it so disappointing, because the trailer really gave away a lot of the plot of the movie, and what I was envisioning going in was the trailer gave away the first third, and the more interesting stuff came after that. But in reality, the trailer really just spoiled the entire movie. A lot of the scenes in this just feel to go on for way too long. The guy from Detective Pikachu is back, and his acting is surprisingly in a similar style to this movie we talked about earlier. But instead of that being something that really hurts the movie, it's something that gives it a very interesting tone in a way. It really didn't click for me, but his very dry, boring, and straightforward delivery added some very surreal elements to it. But the issue with it is that a lot of it didn't click for me, and if it doesn't click for you, then this movie is incredibly boring. It's very slow paced, and once in a while you do get to see those interesting plot developments or some really cool cinematography, but a lot of the times in between, it's just very boring and straightforward dialogue, and the emotional core really didn't click for me. It's not a terrible movie, it's just one that's really disappointing and just didn't work for me at all.
This isn't a meme. I genuinely...
Kung Fu Panda 4, kind of similar to Toy Story 4, is a sequel that really didn't need to exist. The first 3 films perfectly wrapped up the trilogy and felt very cohesive without any real need for the story to go on at all. And like Toy Story 4, though this movie is admittedly quite a bit worse than that one, even though Toy Story 4 isn't very good either, feel like tacked on chapters that have character motivations that feel more like a TV special than an actual sequel movie. Awkwafina is in it like she's in everything. The story isn't very good, the comedy feels like a downgrade compared to the other 3. The villain in this is pretty terrible too. She doesn't feel like a threat at all, she feels more like a mini boss that you would see in a mid-season finale of a TV show. The real saving grace of this movie though, and why it's not even lower, is that a lot of the biggest saving graces for this movie is one, the animation, but also a lot of the character dialogue, especially the ones with Mr. Peng and then Poe's actual dad, feels very natural and comedic. It's lighthearted and fun, and it's not really that deep. It doesn't feel like it adds much to the universe, but it is at least entertaining and a bright spot in this. This is an example of a sequel that really wasn't necessary, and that's unfortunately a common trend with this year. While 2023 had a lot of movies that were sequels, a lot of them felt like they were justified sequels, or ones that I was at least personally really anticipating. But while 2023 thrived on sequels that genuinely continued the story in a very meaningful and real way, 2024 unfortunately was bombarded with sequels that just feel like filler episodes and ones that really didn't need to exist. I mean, most sequels don't really need to exist, but you know what I mean. Venom: The Last Dance is easily the best Sony Spider-Man film that was released this year, and it's still terrible. The reason that this one is so far above the other ones is because this film, at least whenever Eddie and Venom are talking, it feels like it has genuine personality and a little bit of heart behind it. Those scenes are genuinely comedic and feel very entertaining and endearing. Now, that's not to say I felt anything at all whenever Venom died at the end and the Maroon 5 song came on, but still, those scenes were at least amusing. The rest of the film is a real slog though, a lot more similar to the other Sony Spider-Man villain films. The scenes that really bog this down are the ones with the scientists. Their motivations are so cliche and predictable, and every scene with them, I was just waiting for it to be over. The acting with those were pretty terrible. We don't need all of this fake scientific exposition dialogue. We're really just here for that dialogue between Eddie and Venom and those action scenes, which the action scenes are alright. There's some interesting ideas for some of them, especially with all the extra symbiotes, but a lot of the time they're really held back by their shoddy CGI. I haven't seen any other of the Venom films, but this one really didn't motivate me at all to check those out. Mufasa, which is a prequel to the 2019 Lion King movie, is a movie that is disappointing in a very interesting way. It's not disappointing because I had any expectations for this film. I don't think anybody really did. It's disappointed because a lot of the cast and crew behind this are very talented people who have made really good movies in the past. And it's disappointing that they're wasting their time on such a mediocre and forgettable project. This film is the definition of didn't need to exist. The only reason that it exists is for money, which you could say that about a lot of the films on this list, even some of the better ones. But this one still feels like one of the most unnecessary ones. It's a film that's really just forgettable. It's just kids' white noise more than anything else. I really dislike the animation style, but I'm not going to hold that against it too much since that's kind of a holdover from the predecessor. The songs are alright, there's one or two that I thought were okay, but for the most part, they're all just forgettable. The story framing device with Timon, Pumbaa, Rafiki, and then Simba's kid gets really annoying whenever it cuts into the story, mostly because Timon and Pumbaa are never funny in this movie at all. The plot is super predictable, and it draws a lot from other prequel films such as X-Men First Class or Transformers 1, where it's a very predictable best friends to enemies plotline. Overall, it definitely could have been worse, and you can tell that there's some talented people behind this movie because once in a while, it is interesting, but overall it just ends up being a very forgettable and more than anything else unnecessary, hard to stomach movie.
What the dog doing?
The most memorable aspect of Arthur the King is the trailer. And it's not because the trailer was really good or really bad, it's a very mediocre trailer. The reason that it is super memorable to me at least is because for about all 6 months before the movie came out, almost every film I saw in theaters had this trailer before it. It didn't matter if it was a movie like Wish for kids or a movie like Killers of the Flower Moons for a more mature audience. Every single movie, no matter what genre or style, seemed to incorporate this trailer into the rotation. My guess is because it has dogs, so it must appeal to kids in some way, shape, or form. And then it also has Mark Wahlberg, so I guess they assume that more of the art house crowd would be drawn to that. But I just got so sick of this trailer, so because I saw this trailer so many times, Arthur the King quickly became one of my most anticipated films of 2024, just so I didn't have to stomach that trailer one more time. The movie itself is alright. It's a very predictable sports movie. The cast does okay. The dog plotline is about as cliche, predictable, and very obviously emotionally manipulative as you would expect. However, there were a couple scenes that I was kind of impressed by in this movie. There's one scene in particular where they're on a zip line and stuff starts to go wrong that actually felt pretty intense and was a decently shot and paced scene. But overall, it's a very forgettable movie. Not bad, but not that great either.
Uh-oh. Stinky.
Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is boring. I mean, it's not as boring as ISS, Bonhoeffer, and Lost in a Mountain in Maine, but still, it was a real slog to get through, which is a shame. I'm not the biggest fan of the trilogy of the Planet of the Apes movies that came out in the 2010s, but still, all of them had some elements that were still compelling to me, Rise being my personal favorite out of the three. This movie, though having some decent CGI and an interesting plot in some ways, just has a real struggle with knowing how to pace all of that. It feels like we take forever to get to any interesting plotline or development in the movie. And the characters, while not terrible, don't exactly make that journey a lot more interesting. The dialogue feels very dry, and I feel like we aren't immersed in this world in the way that we should be. I mean, we are shown a lot of the scenery, and a lot of the movie is supposed to reflect on that world building and just taking it all in. But I didn't feel a reason to feel immersed in this world compared to some others. It just felt like a generic post-apocalyptic overgrown world. The movie is competently made in a lot of ways, but its biggest issue is it's just way too slowly paced and way too boring. And I feel like those shouldn't be issues for a monkey movie.
Ollie's deals are so good, you won't believe the prices.
Ollie!
Good stuff, cheap!
Harold and the Purple Crayon is a movie. To me, it falls into a similar camp for a movie like Stuart Little, where it does have a decent level of competency and it's not terrible for kids, but doesn't have any lasting impact and doesn't have much for the adults in the audience to latch onto. The most funny parts of this movie to me are the fact that they spend a good chunk of one scene at Ollie's, which is basically the discount Walmart, and this movie feels like a discount Disney movie. So if you think about it, it's a match made in heaven. The movie suffers from a lot of the trappings that you would expect from a typical movie that is aimed at small children. A lot of the dialogue is very childish, a lot of the jokes really don't land, and the characters' motivations are very thin. However, the one thing that does elevate this movie quite a bit is the villain. Even though he's not really given that great of material to work with, Jermaine Clement still tries his best to salvage this character, and honestly does a pretty good job. He's really the most interesting part of the movie, and his psychology behind what he's trying to do is a little more interesting and deep than I expected it to be. And obviously he was really hamming it up during the whole movie. Whenever he's not on screen, it's not necessarily boring, but just very bland. It's not a terrible movie, but there's not really much here.
Nacho Bel Grande, cheesy gordita. I like your nachos like diarrhea. Man, I really like Taco Bell.
Snack Shack is a movie that really isn't for me, and I have nothing interesting to say about.
Think of a big black man chasing you!
Well, he's not racist.
There's a lot of politically charged motivations for liking or disliking the movie Am I Racist? But my reason for being very middling on it is that it's not nearly as funny as it could have been. Now, there are some segments that are pretty funny, like the conference at the end, and there are a few other sparse moments of comedy, but for a lot of it, it just felt like it was really meandering and not funny. It was having these people say their political ideologies on this, which you may agree with, you may disagree with, but the joke far too often is how extreme Matt Walsh sees these views as, which isn't particularly funny. It's either going to be very infuriating if you agree with a lot of what these people are saying and really dislike Matt Walsh and what he stands for, or it's going to be really depressing if you do think that what they're saying is crazy, because you're going to be going with the ideology that this is taking over our nation and making it go downhill. It feels like fear-mongering rather than comedy, though I will give it props, there are a couple of good segments, but that's not enough to save the whole movie. Who would have guessed that for a comedy to be good, it would have to be funny consistently?
And cut! Ah, a star is born. Everyone, go home. I'm rewriting all of your parts.
Fly Me to the Moon is a perfectly serviceable comedy film. Its premise is a little out there and its budget was way too high and is not very apparent whenever you actually look at it. But despite all that, there are still some endearing moments and the characters are likable enough to carry this along. There's not really that much to say, it's just a very serviceable movie.
Hello, your computer has virus.
Moonja is fine. It's probably a movie that none of you have really heard of before. It's an Indian film that just so happened to be playing at my theater on an afternoon where I was free, so I just decided, whatever, I'll go and see it. The main reason that I did decide to see it was because of its very interesting synopsis on the Regal website. I can't find it specifically online, but whenever Regal listed this film, its description said, essentially, this is the best summer movie for Gen Z people. Everybody will be thrilled with its sense of action and comedy. Almost like a IGN review, except that was the film's plot description. That made me interested enough to at least see it. It's a very whatever film. My biggest issue when seeing this wasn't with the film itself, but actually with the theater it was playing in. For whatever reason, this and a couple Indian films that I saw last year, the theater decided to pump up the volume to an extreme degree where pretty much all the time the sound was peaking. At a certain point, I just gave up and put in my AirPods and turned them to noise cancellation mode so the sound was at least tolerable. Ordinary Angels is a completely serviceable Christian film that does do some things really well, but has a few very fundamental flaws to it. The story is one that inherently tugs at your heartstring no matter what your background is. It's about a kid who's dying and a dad desperately trying to figure out what to do with all the hospital bills and also be a good father and take care of this kid. The story involves another lady who finds out about this problem and decides she needs to do something and help. The characterization is okay, and the plot is inherently interesting. The biggest issue with this film is that it's very repetitive in how it's structured. It always goes that the girl gets sick, and then the lady comes in and she helps however she can, and then she helps a little too much, and the dad gets upset about the charity part, and then he sends her away, and then eventually the kid gets sick again, and the whole cycle keeps going on over and over and over again. It makes it very predictable and tedious at a point. For a lower budget Christian movie, it's surprisingly decently shot and pretty well acted. It's just that repetitive plot that really hinders it in a lot of ways. Bob Marley: One Love is a movie that really works in some ways and really doesn't work in other ways. The biggest issue with the movie and what really holds it back a lot is that it has a very flimsy plot. The plot just feels like a random series of events, not really pointing towards any specific character arcs or any destination or a thing that we're working towards. It just feels like a random series of vignettes that are strung together, but it's not presented as that. It doesn't feel like it's supposed to be a slice of life type of movie. It feels like it's supposed to be one that's leading towards something, but it never gets there. Because of that, a lot of the times, it's hard to get invested in the character's struggles or be totally interested in the dialogue. However, what saves this film is that it's basically just 2 hours of really good music.
The Bluetooth device is ready to pair.
Blue Lock Episode Nagi was a very mediocre movie. Now, to be fair to it, I'm really not a fan of sports movies, and I have no previous knowledge of what the Blue Lock franchise is like. This film, it does have some pretty engaging soccer sequences at certain points, but it feels like the character arcs aren't very well handled. It's also very jarring for a newcomer how we spend all this time on these kind of interesting events for a while, but then at a certain point in the story where you think it's going to reach its climax, it just turns into a clip show of what apparently happened in season 1. And at the end, it just gives you a cliffhanger that apparently season 1 already ended with. It overall makes it a very dissatisfying movie experience. However, I will give props to those sports sequences. A lot of them were engaging, they had very well set out consequences, and the character motivations did make sense.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
Self-Reliance is about as typical of a streaming movie as you can get. Though it's not really slop, it doesn't really have that much interesting to offer. It's one of those movies with a very gimmicky plot that is inherently interesting in a few different ways. And it has some good jokes here and there. There are a couple cool action sequences, but there's not really that sauce that makes it a great film, or even one that's that good. It's just an okay movie. Okay characters, okay plot, okay sequences, okay cinematography, just a very okay movie. It's the definition of a Hulu movie. It's the definition of a Hulu original. It's the definition of a Hulu original movie.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Orion in the Dark is a very disappointing movie in a lot of ways. Now that could be because my expectations for it were too high. But the fact that Charlie Kaufman had a hand in this made me very intrigued to say the least. I never expected it to be this good, but it kind of reminded me whenever Wes Anderson took on Fantastic Mr. Fox, and how that is a pretty much child-friendly movie, but with a lot of adult themes, and how it's structured makes it one of the best movies for all ages. Orion in the Dark, on the other hand, feels very childish in nature. You can tell that its animation was on a TV budget. It doesn't look the best, especially the character designs. The plot feels very childish, obviously revolving around a kid being afraid of the dark and being afraid of pretty much anything. And it's not really twisted into a way where it makes it interesting or relatable for the adults watching the film. It makes more so for a decent children's film that can teach them an alright lesson, but not really much left for adults.
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
Lisa Frankenstein is yet another alright movie. The story is kind of bleh, and sometimes it feels like the themes are very mishandled, but it makes up for it a lot of the time with some decent performances and some really nice sets. The film does feel amateurish in a lot of ways and derivative of some other films, but I do admire its creativity and that even though it is pretty mediocre at the end of the day, it does feel different and it does feel creative in a lot of ways. Argylle is a film that I feel is very overhated. I mean, it's not a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought it was fun enough. The story is really stupid, and the twists do get super annoying at a certain point. But the action sequences were pretty engaging throughout the whole thing. Some of the performances weren't bad too. And I do like that in its last act, especially in a lot of the action sequences there, it does feel like it is trying to be unique and do something different. Now, a lot of the times it doesn't really work fully how it intended, and a lot of the times it does get bogged down by the twists it has to have every 5 minutes. But overall, with those fairly interesting action sequences, I didn't think it was totally horrible. I thought it was alright.
Another one rides the bus. Another one rides the bus. And another comes on, and another comes on. Another one rides the bus.
The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare falls into a similar camp to Argylle for me. It doesn't really have a lot of strengths that sets it apart from an untypical summer blockbuster, but it is still fun enough. The biggest issue with this movie is that it's very overstuffed. There are too many characters that all feel way too similar. Plus, this movie doesn't really have any stakes. It takes place during the war, and you don't feel any of the pain or anxiety of the war. Now, that's okay if you're going for a lighthearted tone, but there's still no tension during the whole movie. The characters never really lose any of the fights that they go into. It seems like every single battle they get the outcome that they want, which does make for a fun, breezy, lighthearted movie, but lacks a deeper sense of depth. There's just not that much compelling you to watch till the end if every single character in the movie seems to be fine after every single scene that should be intense action, life or death situations. But in the end, none of the characters ever took any damage. But even with all that, it still was pretty fun. Rob Peace is a biopic that doesn't really stand out that much from the crowd, but also doesn't do anything too terribly bad. It covers the story in an entertaining enough way, but a lot of the shots look very flat, but I feel like there wasn't that much going on throughout the whole movie. The characters were fairly interesting in their own ways, but there was nothing really that stuck out to me during the whole thing. Its biggest issue, honestly, is it's just forgettable. As you can tell, that's what it did to me. I can barely remember anything about this movie. Speak No Evil is a decent enough film, and remember, I'm not the biggest fan of horror movies, so take this part with a grain of salt. It falls into a lot of the trappings for why I don't typically enjoy a horror movie, which one of the things that's really heavily in this film is that the characters seem to constantly make really stupid decisions. However, this one's pretty decent, and it's mostly carried by that central performance from James McAvoy. He's very fun in this movie. He's not really that scary, even at the end whenever the twist is revealed to the characters, but he is very entertaining. The way that he typically makes the characters uncomfortable to the point of leaving but then reels them back in with guilt tripping plus a little bit of charisma is very interesting and fun to watch play out. However, for me, it's still a horror movie that falls into a lot of the trappings that the genre finds itself in. And for a lot of it, I found myself fairly bored whenever James McAvoy wasn't on the screen.
Here's my gas can. My brother Josh blew himself up and his 2 kids.
In the Land of Saints and Sinners isn't your typical Liam Neeson film. And by that, I mean it's not your typical low-budget action movie where he stars in just to get a paycheck. This movie, while not that great, does feel like it has a lot more heart and effort put into it than a movie like Blacklight. The plot is very derivative from a couple other movies that I can think of. It might just be because of the accents, but a lot of it reminded me of The Banshees of Inisherin, and the central plot reminded me a lot of the Equalizer films. Liam Neeson is okay in the central role, though you can really tell he's not giving it his all, and the other characters are fine. It's just a very fine movie. It's not really too compelling in a lot of areas, but it gets the job done. It's a very mediocre, passable B-tier film. Haikyuu The Dumpster Battle is yet another anime sports movie that really didn't do it for me. It's very well made from a technical perspective, and from what I've heard, it's a very satisfying conclusion or continuation for a lot of these characters' arcs. But for someone who has no previous experience with the show going into this blind, it didn't really do much for me. It just felt like a really long stretched out volleyball game, which for someone who doesn't care about sports is not the most compelling thing. Overall, it just wasn't a movie for me, and I just found it generally mediocre. Though I'm sure fans of the series get a lot more out of this movie than I do. Alright guys, say it with me. I'm not that into horror. Aliens Romulus is yet another horror film that is competent on a lot of levels, but just didn't do anything for me. What elevated this one for me though was David Johnson's role as Andy. This robot character just felt so natural and unnatural in a really satisfying way. He does a really good job of snapping back and forth between being a robot but also being genuinely caring for the main character. He's really the heart and soul of the film, and I honestly was kind of invested in his plotline. However, a lot of the rest of the film, and especially a lot of the rest of the characters, just didn't do anything for me. It just felt like more typical generic horror stuff. Oh yeah, and the movie was too long too. That was a bit of an issue. Super / Man is definitely a movie. It's a documentary, and that's not usually a genre I'm too interested in. This documentary has an inherently interesting story covering the life of Christopher Reeves, but sometimes it feels like it can be a bit bloated and emotionally manipulative. I mean, you do have a good emotional core, but sometimes it feels like whenever Christopher Reeves does something that we're not supposed to agree with, we are told about that emotional core again, and that's supposed to make us forgive everything that he's done. But to me, it's more interesting to have this flawed character and not make excuses for his actions, but to see how he learns and grows from them. The most interesting part of this movie for me was whenever it focused on the friendship between Christopher Reeves and Robin Williams, and that was probably the truly most heartbreaking part whenever it talked about the effects that it had on Robin Williams. Overall, a decent documentary. I have a few issues with it, but in the end, I mean, it's alright.
I love you, Jesus. Happy birthday, Jesus.
The best Christmas pageant ever follows the common trend of this year with Christian movies where they're not too bad, but they don't have that much special about them either. This one, written and directed by the guy who is responsible for The Chosen, has a very light-hearted tone to it. It's very comedic, and sometimes the jokes land, but oftentimes it's just kind of whatever. The film relies way too heavily on you thinking all these things that the kids are doing is very cutesy, which if that doesn't work for you, then a lot of the jokes of this movie aren't going to work. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Christmas movies in general, so maybe this one would hit different for somebody who was a fan, but for me, a lot of it was just way too cheesy and sentimental for my taste, without really earning those moments. And the over-the-top exaggerated acting didn't help either. However, this is by no means a terrible movie. It does have those jokes that hit once in a while, the characters are endearing enough, and some of the shots look pretty good. If you're someone who's into cheesy Christian movies and cheesy Christmas movies, then this one would be right up your alley. But for me, it was just okay. Small things like these is a very unique experience for me this year, and not really in a very positive way. This movie probably is a lot better than I'm giving it credit for, and it probably would have ranked higher on the list if it wasn't for the condition I saw it in. It was a rainy night in an empty theater, and I just worked a long shift, and I was exhausted, and the movie didn't really do anything to help that. It's a very slow, methodical, and subtly dark film. Cillian Murphy does a really good job of this leading performance of this brooding guy who sees these awful things that are going on and slowly tries to do something about them. Everything about this movie is competent. The acting is pretty good, the shots are pretty good, the story is good, everything about it is good. But for me, it just didn't grab me in any way, shape, or form. I felt myself not bored, but very sleepy throughout the whole thing, and just generally having this sense of discomfort and dread during the whole runtime. Partially because of the movie, but also partially because of the situation I was in that day. Because of that, I can't really be unbiased towards this movie, so I'm putting it here. It could be better, could be worse than I'm giving it credit for, but overall, it's not a terrible film, but it's also not one of the best of the year either. Deadpool and Wolverine is fine. The biggest issue with this movie, to me personally, is that I am not a fan of the comedy style that it goes for. It feels that so often the joke is just they say a bad word or they make some coarse joke and that's supposed to make you laugh. But whenever you're so indoctrinated into that style of humor throughout the whole movie, it feels like that's the only style of humor you're gonna get. And because of that, those jokes lose their luster very quickly. Now, there are some funny moments here and there in the film, but it's not usually coming from that style of comedy. It usually comes from one that you're not expecting as much. In addition to that, the story in this is pretty mediocre. It feels like a generic MCU plot forced into this movie. And Deadpool himself can be pretty annoying sometimes. The saving grace for this movie though is that it does have a couple of really good scenes. The opening credits scene set to the NSYNC song is really fun and really satisfying, and the car scene later down in the movie is also really solid too. Those two scenes alone really elevate this movie. I know a lot of people were big fans of the cameos here, but honestly, cameos don't really do that much for me. Overall, this film is pretty mediocre and it does have a lot of issues, but those few scenes that are really great action sequences elevate it quite a bit further up.
From the screen to the ring.
This just in, the new Lord of the Rings film, War of the Rohirrim, is apparently a movie. We go now live to our reporter on the field with more.
Hey guys, welcome to a brand new episode of What We Watch. I'm on the field right now with Nick Anderson, and we just got out of the movie Lord of the Rings, War of the Rohirrim. Now, Nicholas Neil Anderson, I'd like to hear what your thoughts were on the movie.
It was a movie that we watched. It was like 2 hours long.
2 hours and 15 minutes.
And there was a girl that did the thing, and there's bad guys that did the thing.
Was she pretty?
She was alright. I mean, it was bad. And there's bad guys that did the bad thing, and then so the good guys tried to stop the bad guys from doing the bad thing.
What would you rate this film out of 1 to 10?
I'd give it a solid 6.5. It wasn't like peak, but I'd watch it again.
Yeah. My biggest issue with the movie personally was that the animation was distractingly bad. I mean, for a widely released animated film, now it is really nice to have a 2D PG-13 animated film in theaters. That was a really cool part of it. But the animation, especially compared to a lot of other anime, not just anime movies, but anime TV shows, felt like a big step backwards in a lot of ways. Something that was really distracting to me was, in a lot of the scenes, since it takes place in winter, there are a lot of fires that are lit. And if you look closely at them, you could tell like whenever the animation for the fire looped. And also, it felt like it didn't really care that much about giving detail to the characters or making their movements flow that well. But a lot of the times, it just felt like it was doing the bare minimum for that. Also, for the original Lord of the Rings, what really works for that is that it has a very large ensemble of characters, but all of them are distinctly unique. This movie had a very large ensemble of characters, but it felt like they were afraid to develop any of them more beside, oh, this person is heroic. Oh, this person is evil. Oh, this person is old. Very, very one-dimensional characters. And also the story felt like it had very little consequence. It felt like a movie that could have just been in any generic fantasy world, but was slapped with the Lord of the Rings name just to make it part of the IP. What do you think, Nick?
So the movie had really weird animation, I'll agree. The characters were poorly animated, but the backgrounds and like the scenery was well animated.
It was well designed. I will give it that.
So having that overlay kind of threw it off a little bit. It's one of the first things I noticed. Character movements were kind of blocky at times. Things like that.
Yeah.
Oh, way down south in the land of traders, rattlesnakes and alligators, right away.
Civil War is a pretty interesting film. I think for many, they had a similar experience to me, where going into the film, we were really anticipating seeing this made-up fantasy issue that ended up splitting the nation. But in reality, the film makes the decision to not show us this issue, but just show us the outcome and results of it. Now, that is pretty disappointing at first, especially because it seems like from a lot of the advertising, that's what the film was building up to be. But at the same time, it really does benefit giving it a politically neutral stance on stuff. I mean, whatever the issue is, we are told that the states that succeeded first are Texas and California, which obviously don't have that many politically united views on stuff. The film, however, decides to focus more so on the element of photography and capturing the horrors of war, which does make for an interesting premise. It's just kind of unfortunate that a lot of the sequences in this movie feel fairly repetitive and don't really say much. The best one by far was the one with the guy in the pink glasses, but that was also because it was the most intense and felt like it had the most stakes in the film. I also take some issue with the sound editing here. At least the way it was in my theater, the last act was just way too loud and it was peaking a lot of the sound system throughout it all. It's a very dark and depressing film, which is appropriate since it is a film about war. I do appreciate how it portrays this theoretical civil war and the awful consequences that come with it. But it does feel like a missed opportunity to explore some deeper themes. Not necessarily politically charged ones, but going a bit deeper into the idea of why we become so separated. Nanoshark should not be this high on this list because, I mean, look at it. Does that look like a movie that should be ranked higher than everything we just talked about? But this movie surprised me because though it has a budget of a college short film, even though we're working with that kind of budget, this movie surprisingly does deliver in a number of interesting ways. Obviously not the action or the thrill is going to be there, but there's a very stupid yet effective source of comedy in this film. A lot of the dialogue is surprisingly cleverly written for a film of this stature. There are a few jokes that actually got to me, and the low budget feel of the whole thing is made fun of a number of times throughout the film. And honestly, overall, just made it a very enjoyable and fun movie to watch. So though it's not technically good on a lot of ways, you can tell that they tried their best, especially whenever comparing it to a lot of other low budget shark movies. This one is actually decent, surprisingly.
How's your stakeout shake from Cookout? Stakeout kick.
Musica is a pretty interesting little film. What grabbed me most starting out this film is how it obviously takes inspirations from Baby Driver and Edgar Wright's directing style in that film. You can tell with a lot of the musical sequences, they're very intricately timed and shot with what they were going to show at what time and how everything is timed to the beat of the music. And this film does have some pretty good jokes too. However, it just feels kind of mediocre at the end of the day. The story and characters aren't that interesting to write home about, but it's a film that you still want to love because you can tell that it's made by a fairly inexperienced team, but it has a lot of heart and passion put into it. So while not great, it very much is charming in its own special kind of way.
Come on, jump. I said jump!
Ghost Cat Anzu is a very entertaining but still derivative movie. You can tell that it takes a lot of inspiration and sometimes too many plot details from a lot of Ghibli movies like My Neighbor Totoro and Spirited Away. However, if you're gonna borrow, it makes sense to borrow from movies like that. The movie's story is very predictable, but it does have a lot of interesting elements, especially during the last act where they go to a different world and they bring a lot of ghosts back with them. The main character in this movie is okay. She's kind of annoying at times, kind of endearing at times, but she's not really too terribly interesting as a protagonist. However, the ghost cat Anzu in this movie carries it. Now, there is a few jokes for him that completely brought his character down a lot, namely a couple fart jokes, but a lot of the other times, it feels like he's very well written, kind of like a combination of Garfield and Totoro. He's very lazy, but very capable at the same time. Also, there's a scene in this film where Anzu gets a lot of money and he decides to go to the casino and he ends up losing it all. And that just really struck a chord with me, because I know if most cats could walk and talk, they would absolutely have a gambling addiction.
Stu is great. We really like him.
Abigail is a really fun and engaging horror comedy. I was very surprised when we were watching this film that the twist of the girl being a vampire wasn't really talked about or revealed until a decent way into the film. It brought a really good sense of getting to know these other characters before they inevitably had to fight for their lives. And whenever it finally is revealed, it's a lot of fun watching these people try to figure out how to defeat her. The movie overall is pretty fun and pretty funny too, but there are a couple major flaws that weigh it down from being anything other than pretty good. The first is the pacing and the length of the film. It just feels like it goes on for about 15 minutes too long, and there are a couple too many twists and plot developments that kind of make you lose interest by the end. The other issue, and the one that is much bigger, is the cursing in the movie. This movie is unfortunately stuffed to the brim with cursing, and it gets very annoying very quickly. It's one of those things where it's not really an issue about the morality of cursing, it's more so an issue that the cursing feels so frequent and unnatural in the way it's used. There's one character in this film where it feels like every other sentence of him has to have a curse word in it, and it just becomes annoying and very unnatural at a certain point. But looking past that pretty big flaw, the movie is very fun. All the characters are very well differentiated from each other, and the house that this takes place in is a character all of its own. It's shot really well too. Overall, a pretty fun film, but held back quite a bit by a couple of major flaws.
All around me are familiar faces, worn out
Furiosa is at least better than the Garfield movie. In all honesty, it's a completely competent film that just feels like it's really held down by the comparisons to Mad Max Fury Road. The movie has a lot of interesting character dynamics and fun enough action, but it just doesn't feel like it has the same charisma and spectacle of Fury Road. This is also a personal thing, but the movie felt like it was very much too depressing at a lot of points. It made it a lot more difficult to take these action sequences that were supposed to be fun as actually fun. The best part of this movie is Chris Hemsworth as the villain. Pretty much every scene that he was in was really good. And Anya Taylor-Joy does do a decent job as Furiosa, but Chris Hemsworth is the one who steals the show. Now on the list, we're officially at the 7 out of 10s and above, which at this point, they're films that I would generally recommend to people. And starting us off with these films, we have The Watchers. Now this movie got a lot of hate whenever it came out, but I never really completely understood it. To me, it is a very competent and actually fairly compelling thriller. It has an inherently interesting concept with these people being lost in the woods, and them finding this house where they have to be at a certain place at night to let these different creatures look at them and watch them. There's a good sense of mystery that goes on for a majority of the film. And it's really at its best whenever it is focusing on that mystery that's found there, and questioning what's real, what's not, and how do we get out of this situation. Now the movie does definitely drag in the last act when there's a twist revealed and the location changes, but even with that, it just felt kind of unnecessary. Not necessarily bad, but I was really enthralled by a majority of the movie where it was taking place in the forest. It had a very compelling sense of mystery and excitement to it, and I was genuinely interested in what was going to happen next. I don't know how well it'll hold up on a rewatch with all the twists being revealed already, but at least from my perspective, it's a very fun and interesting, and also a bit of a creepy movie, and just overall a pretty decent movie.
What is that? It's the end dog.
It was fine. As far as legacy sequels go, Beetlejuice is one of the better ones that I've seen. And I think a main reason for that is because it doesn't feel like it's capped on the creativity that the original had. It feels like it has just as many fun ideas and situations as that film. What holds it back from being as good as the original though is the story. While the original film is just basically one, maybe two intersecting plot lines that you could argue, this second one has like 5 plots going on at the same time, and some are vastly more interesting than others. Because there's so many plots going on, I feel like none of them really got developed as much as they should. A lot of the character arcs just felt very rushed. I really enjoyed all the stuff in the underworld with Willem Dafoe and all the stuff that was going on with this criminal running around, but so much of it just felt unnecessary. Similarly, I thought the plotline with Jenna Ortega and the boy had way too much time spent on it, and the end was resolved way too quickly too. But again, what makes this film a lot better is that creativity that is on full display. There is a lot of great use of practical effects in this movie, and a lot of fun, grotesque sequences. It would be nice if it was stitched together a little better, but this movie does definitely deliver what a legacy sequel should. More of the same, with a little upped ante, and with no harm done to the original.
Just give it a try.
All right, maybe just a little.
Attention parents and grandparents of young children. Gerber Life is accepting applications for their affordable grow-up plan.
Inside Out 2 surprisingly ended up being one of the better Pixar sequels in the past 10 years. And that's partially because it's a sequel to a franchise that actually feels like it could use sequels. A franchise where it doesn't seem like the story is over, or it doesn't feel like there's nowhere to go with it. Probably the best part about this movie is that it does feel like a natural continuation, because it makes sense that we would want to follow the perspective of somebody who is changing, since a lot of the parts of growing up involve different types of emotions and different ways that we go about and feel things. The animation in this movie is really good, though the plot does seem to be a little derivative from the first. It feels a little far-fetched that such similar events happen again, where these emotions, this time all of them instead of just 2, are tossed out of HQ and have to find their way back somehow. The way that this movie deals with anxiety does feel pretty natural, and it's handled fairly well, but it doesn't feel like it goes into it enough to really stand out that much from some other recent examples like Puss in Boots 2. With that being said, it still does a pretty good job of getting its message across. This film is almost as good as the original. The only thing that I feel like is missing are those companion characters. Because in the first film, we had Bing Bong, who acted as an interesting foil to the emotions. He was able to be more lively, expressive, and, well, express more emotions. In this film, I thought we were going to get that with the Blue's Clues Bluey character that showed up in the vault, or maybe the Cloud Final Fantasy Smash Brothers character that was also in there, but they just show up for a couple of scenes and then just disappear for the rest of the movie. I don't know if it would necessarily have worked better with them, but I was actually looking forward to them following the main characters around during the whole plot, but they just kind of disappeared. The movie also feels like it doesn't have quite the stakes of the original, but that doesn't weigh it down too much. My only other real criticism of it is it does feel like the comedy isn't as on point as Inside Out 1. I mean, Inside Out 1 did have its handful of dud jokes, but it felt like it was more consistently funny. But Inside Out 2 is at least just as consistently imaginative, entertaining, and is overall a solid follow-up.
When I look back, it is over, but I still feel the same.
Look Back is a very brief but still very touching anime movie. Not to really spoil what happens, but it does feel very emotional, but I did have a few issues with it feeling a bit emotionally manipulative at certain points. I mean, I guess I do have a resistance to that. If I'm going to watch a movie, I'm typically not going to feel sad. So if that's the primary emotion that the movie is trying to portray, it usually doesn't work as well on me. But still with that, the animation is really good and the characters are very likable. It may not be my cup of tea, but it is a very well done film.
There's going to be a lot less conversation and a lot more killing.
Gladiator 2 is another surprisingly very well-made legacy sequel. While definitely not as good as the original, it does thrive mostly in the action scenes. It's set apart a lot by those action scenes in the Colosseum, but not as much by the story or the character arcs. Those feel more like a repeat of the first film. The best way that I could describe this film is amusing. The first film obviously has the iconic line of, "Are you not entertained?" And the first film, I would say, is very entertaining. The second film has a line that is kind of reminiscent from that, where it says, "Are you not amused?" And I would say that Gladiator 2 is amusing. And there's a difference between those two. The first Gladiator movie is entertaining. It's really fun to watch, but there is some deeper meat to its bones. You can tell that there's a lot more passion and thought behind a lot of what went into it. There are certain themes and messages that you can get from it that feel like it's worthwhile and not just a silly piece of entertainment. The second Gladiator film is amusing, which means it's something that you enjoy watching and it is fun, but there's not much substance behind it. But still, surprisingly, for a sequel to Gladiator 24 years later, it was surprisingly decent. Piece by Piece is a very mediocre documentary, elevated to a really solid movie by the creativity displayed in the animation. Because watching this film, the story of Pharrell Williams isn't one that's all that engaging. It feels like things come a little too easy, and a lot of the more down parts feel like his own fault rather than the world being against him. It doesn't really feel as much like an underdog story as I think the writers intended it to be, or how much Pharrell Williams really sees it as. But what makes this film really good is the animation. Though it is given sometimes kind of boring stories to work with, the animation team always found ways to make it interesting and engaging. They always found different sight gags to put in, different unique ways to express emotions and creativity, and they made every single scene feel so much better. Also, this movie really thrives because it does have that Pharrell Williams music. So the music and the animation are really good, but the plot is kind of I just wish that this general premise was done with somebody who has a fairly more interesting story than Pharrell Williams. Solo Leveling Reawakened is a pretty decent piece of media, though it flounders quite a bit as a film. And that's because it is really just a recap of an anime season plus the first 2 episodes of the new season. So though it doesn't really work with the narrative structure of any typical film, it's still a very entertaining and satisfying piece of media. But with that being said, I feel like all the themes and the great animation and the character work done in this would be a lot more satisfying if you just watched the show itself. But even though it is kind of a Frankenstein of season 1, I still found it going in blind to be very entertaining, and it got me really interested in watching the show further.
They call me the hip-hop-opotamus. My lyrics are bottomless.
Unsung Hero is a surprisingly very well-made Christian film. You can tell it takes a lot of inspiration from similar Christian films like I Can Only Imagine and I Still Believe, where it's a music biopic, but they do use the Christian themes to elevate the characters and make their actions make more sense in a lot of ways. And this movie is very similar to those. It's a story that involves a lot of tragedy and triumph, and its emotional moments surprisingly work really well. The music doesn't feel too in your face or like it's self-promotion, and overall it's just a surprisingly well shot, well acted, well directed Christian biopic.
911, let's go!
Bad Boys Ride or Die is a very fun movie. Now, I haven't seen any of the other films in this franchise, so I don't know how it stacks up to them, but for this one at least, it was a very fun romp. The action scenes are really fun, the story isn't that great, but it doesn't really need to be, it's more of a vehicle. I love how some of the scenes are lit. They're kind of akin to something like a John Wick scene where they're lit with a lot of interesting neo lights that contrast and highlight the action, though obviously not nearly as interesting or well used as those films. The comedy is surprisingly solid, and it's just a fun overall movie.
Oh man, that was totally wicked!
Wicked is a very heavily flawed movie. The biggest issue with it is how it looks. So many of the shots in the movie just don't look good at all. A lot of the scenes look way too overly lit, but not with the lighting making the characters stand out, but with the lighting drawing your eyes to the windows or the backgrounds instead of what you should be looking at. The movie also isn't shot that interestingly for a musical. There are a couple of exceptions to this, like the Dancing Through Life music sequence, but for a lot of it, it feels fairly sterile for how beautiful the sets that they built are. The characterization is pretty good, but the story, you really feel that it's a part one, and it can kind of drag sometimes whenever you're about an hour and a half in and you're still at the school. There's just so many problems. I don't understand how anybody could like this movie. Okay, I'll get it now. Dee Dee is a fairly effective indie drama film. I heard a lot of people got a lot more out of this because they could relate and had nostalgia for the early 2000s culture that this movie obviously indulges in quite a bit, but that part didn't really work on me. And also another aspect that kind of rubbed me the wrong way was the main character. I know that half of the point is that he's kind of an idiot, kind of a jerk, and it's a learning process, but it was still kind of difficult to watch sometimes. However, this movie does still work pretty well as a comedy, as a drama, as an overall solid movie. Transformers 1 is a very well done prequel in the same style of X-Men First Class. The animation in this film didn't really impress me that much. The action scenes were well done, but I feel like a lot of the character designs just looked way too plasticky. The movie does a really good job with its world building. Without really much any knowledge of the Transformers universe prior to watching this, it explained things pretty well and got me fairly invested in the world. The two main characters were pretty likable, though the comic relief character got on my nerves a little bit, but the character arc felt natural, especially the corruption of the villain at the end. Overall, solid movie, not really much to say.
No. Wait.
Trap is a really fun M. Night Shyamalan film. The story of a secret serial killer being at this concert and it being set up as a trap for him is one that's pretty ridiculous, but is surprisingly pulled off very well. Shyamalan's signature strange dialogue works surprisingly well here. Unlike a movie like Old, where it more so hinders the story, here it more so adds a very strange atmosphere, which works especially well for the main character as he feels like a psychopath, A, because he's written like that, but B, because this abnormal dialogue makes him even more unsettling. Pretty much the whole part of the film that takes place in the concert is really fun. I love how the movie puts you in the shoes of the serial killer and it gets you to look around, see your environment, and see how you can use it to your advantage. There are so many really engaging scenes of the main character just walking around. The blatant promotion of M. Night Shyamalan's daughter's music is fine. Her music is fine, and it is sweet that he did that for his daughter, but it's not really anything that stands out. The last act that takes place in a different location does start to drag a little bit, but it never really gets bad. I do think it has too many fake out endings and one too many twists, but overall, it's a really fun ride. Spy X Family Code White is a movie that I was anticipating quite a bit. Now, I'm a pretty big fan of this franchise, but more specifically, I'm a fan of the manga. I started reading the manga at a pretty dark time in my life, and it really brought me a sense of joy during that time. I keep up with it whenever it releases, but I haven't really been watching the anime, since a lot of the times I feel like it's basically taking verbatim what happens in the manga and not adding much artistic flair to it. So I was pretty curious how this movie would turn out, since it's not based on any pre-existing material, but it's an original story with original dialogue that was come up by the creators of the show. And it turned out pretty decent. It's not as good as some of the best arcs in the series, like the cruise ship arc, but still is overall a really fun time. My biggest issue with it is that it took a really long time to get off the ground. The first few minutes are really difficult because it's basically just non-stop exposition, so people who haven't seen the show or read the manga can get caught up to speed on how everything works. And I also wasn't a big fan of Yor's subplot in this movie. It feels very derivative of a lot of the plots that she's already been through, and almost was a character regress in a lot of ways. But whenever this movie gets going, it really gets going. Everything after the poop sequence was some of my favorite action that I've seen this year on film. So creative, so fluent, so stylized. It was so engaging in so many different ways. So yeah, overall, I feel like they really nailed the tone and the action, though the characters and the comedy aren't quite as good as the series, but still a very welcome addition to the Spy Family lineup. Probably the biggest surprise for me this year was that Twisters wasn't a complete piece of garbage. I mean, a legacy sequel to the movie Twister doesn't exactly sound like a winning formula, but it surprisingly was a very engaging and really thrilling thriller. The characters weren't all that deep, they didn't really need to be, but every single action scene in this movie is very tense and very well made. I want to give a special shout outs to the audio design of this film. In the theater, whenever you hear that tornado, you really do feel it, and it does a really good job of emulating that sound in a very natural way. It doesn't drown out the character dialogue too much whenever that's a necessity, but it also doesn't drain the tension at all. I'm not the biggest fan of how the plot plays out, especially because it feels like a very radical turn for the main character to go from this scientist group to this more country YouTuber group, and the change of the scientist group being made out to be the bad guys in some ways feels very forced and not natural to what we learned in the first part of the movie. But even with some dumb stuff in the film, it's still a very engaging and thrilling time. Seagrass is a really fun film, but before we get to that, I need to ask a question. At the beginning of this film, there's a lot of logos, and one of them is Game Theory Productions. Is this associated at all with like the Game Theory Film Theory channel? Or does it just happen to be a coincidence? I can't really find anything about this online, so I have no clue. But anyway, Seagrass is a really nice film. The best way I could describe this movie is like My Neighbor Totoro, except with divorce. It centers on the plot of this family going away on this retreat, and the couple having a rocky relationship during that time. It's a very slow and methodical film, but what really struck me about it is how a lot of the scenes were structured. In a typical movie, a lot of these scenes would cut off right whenever the action ends. But in this movie, a lot of the times, after something interesting happens, it pans to the ocean or an interesting set piece, and stays there for an uncomfortable amount of time. I really appreciated that it did this because it felt like it got you to think during the film. It was almost like a slow burn, intentionally building up inside of you emotions for what you're expecting here, what your expectations are, and what's going to happen next. It sounds like a gimmick that wouldn't work and would absolutely destroy the pacing, but it actually makes for a very methodical watch. Very solid little drama here, very sad movie in a lot of ways, but very uplifting in others. Nose to Quit is a surprisingly very fun movie. I wasn't really expecting anything going in, but the way that New York is shot in this movie was so utterly engaging to me. This movie is basically about a realtor who's having a really bad day, and a lot of the movie focuses on not the rough neighborhoods of New York, but the more gross and bad parts about the decent neighborhoods in New York. It's a very uncomfortable and anxiety-inducing movie to watch, but somehow at the same time a very fun movie to watch.
Never back down, never what?
Never give up.
Never back down, never what?
Never give up.
Let's go!
Boy Kills World is a very crazy movie. The best way I could explain it is action that is kind of akin to John Wick, but more of the energy of a film like Kung Fu Hustle. It's very chaotic and crazy, not everything makes complete sense, and a lot of the times it focuses on comedy rather than characters. However, it was still a fun ride from beginning to end. I really appreciated how the set pieces seemed to escalate throughout the whole film, and the twist at the end was nice too. Now, it may be a little strange having A Quiet Place Day 1 this high on the list, since I've previously established that I'm not a fan of horror movies, but the Quiet Place movies do something interesting that I don't find in many horror movies. Instead of reveling in the violence, these movies seem to really take their time and care about the characters. It's not like a slasher film where half of the appeal is seeing these characters die. It's a thriller movie where you don't want to see these characters die. And the heart of these films is actually caring about and loving these characters and hoping to make it through this situation. This film, like the last two, is no exception to this rule. Both of the main characters do a great job at showing the humanity in this post-apocalyptic world. You care a lot about their struggles and you genuinely want to see them make it through. All of that is well and good and makes it about on par with the other two Quiet Place movies. But what really stands out in this film is Frodo the cat. Just having that extra interesting dynamic of a pet as one of the main characters adds a whole nother level of tension to a lot of the scenes in this movie. I don't know how they got the cat to be so quiet on set, but it really worked, and it made the main character's emotional struggle all the more compelling. Overall, solid movie not because it revels in the violence or the scares that it presents, but because it displays the humanity and the desire to live and why that is something that we should treasure.
When he died, I was so sad that I would never hear that voice again. His laugh.
I've seen Ghostlight, and I am sad to report that it does not feature Mater. I'm sorry, I was disappointed too. However, what Ghostlight does give us is a very compelling therapy through art type of movie. It deals with a lot of heavy themes that I'm not going to spoil, but it deals with them in a very subtle and yet careful way. It never feels like it's talking down to the audience, and it makes you genuinely care about these people who are going through this tough situation. Though they might not be the best people, it makes you want to see them get better. It may be weird to say that I really enjoyed a movie where a family works through their devastating trauma, but it's just really well made and very engaging, and pretty wholesome considering the subject matter too.
I will never forgive you!
Exhibiting Forgiveness is another therapy through art movie, although this one focuses more on paintings rather than plays. It has a lot of similar strengths to the previous film. However, the reason that I enjoyed this one slightly more is because I feel like it gives a little more interesting character dynamics for the whole family. This film focuses on the son, and his mom is a faithful Christian who always tried to raise him right. But his dad used to be a deadbeat, somebody who abused him, somebody who did all these terrible things. And the plot revolves around the mom bringing the son in and trying to get the dad and the son to have reconciliation. This movie is a very realistic portrayal of that. The main character expresses how he feels often through the paintings that he makes. And through that and flashbacks, you really do get a sense of hating this father figure. But at the same time, you get such an interesting portrayal of him genuinely being saved and genuinely wanting forgiveness. He's still a very flawed man, but you can see that he's making strides. And that makes it all the more palpable, this struggle that the main character is going through, of forgiveness or holding on to the past. It's a very interesting dynamic that's explored in a very compelling way. Just a very solid movie, exploring the very complicated subject of forgiveness.
Can I offer you a nice egg in this trying time?
Problemista is a movie where I don't know if I got the title right or not. It's an A24 comedy about an immigrant trying to find work, and surprisingly finds a number of ways to make that engaging and funny. I love how this movie presents that struggle in a very realistic but also surreal way. I really enjoyed whenever the film cut to something that represented the struggle that the main character was going through, but in a way that seemed larger than life. It deals very well with the themes of loneliness and just trying to make it and survive another day.
The Olive Garden. When you're here, you're family.
Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is surprisingly the best one in the trilogy so far. Now, the first Sonic film was a real surprise to me. It's not an amazing film by any means, but it is a very fun watch. Sonic 2, on the other hand, was a bit of a downgrade. While still decent, especially by the standards of video game adaptations, it felt way too long. And the reason that it felt way too long was because of some added human subplots, which seemed to just drag the whole movie's pacing down. Sonic 3, on the other hand, basically ditches most of the issues that I have with the first two films. A lot of the boring human subplots are cut to a bare minimum. And the best part of this whole franchise, Jim Carrey as Dr. Robotnik, is doubled because Jim Carrey is playing 2 Dr. Robotniks now. The movie is just straight up dumb fun. So many of the action sequences are kind of like the best Sonic games, where in the back of your head you think, oh, that's so stupid, but if you actually give in to what your heart's saying, you're like, that's pretty epic. Scenes like the showdown with Shadow in Tokyo are really well done. They're super fun and engaging in really stupid ways, but you're watching a Sonic film, so stupidity is kind of part of the whole ride. The references in this one are also pretty well done too. A lot of the music cues like Live and Learn, or some of the shot references like Eggman peeing on the moon are really fun to spot. Overall, solid, surprisingly the best one of the whole franchise, like by a long shot. Would recommend, definitely would watch again. Hundreds of Beavers is a very unique comedy. Compared to the crew's last movie, Michigan Lake Monster, this one is a vast improvement. Not only is the budget much higher, but the creativity is much better too. You can tell even by the trailer that the budget is low, but they make use of it in such an interesting way. The effects aren't meant to look realistic, they're meant to look stylized, and that works so well, especially since this movie has a very unique style of comedy. If you enjoyed old Charlie Chaplin movies, or Buster Keaton movies, then this movie is probably going to be right up your alley. It's completely silent and the music is really good. It's black and white, but the cinematography is great. It's just an overall very fun and very funny movie.
Came from the bottom, now I'm at the top. This is the sound of a robot.
The Wild Robot ended up being one of DreamWorks' best movies. It doesn't quite hit the highs of Puss in Boots 2, Shrek 1 or Shrek 2, or The Prince of Egypt, but it's still up there as one of their best. The animation and the colors really pop and make this world come to life. The dialogue feels very natural, and for pretty much all of the jokes in the movie, it doesn't feel like it's talking down to the audience. I also love the themes that this movie has of found family. All of the characters are super entertaining and voice acted really well. I'm surprised they made a robot feel this emotional and yet somehow very realistic at the same time. The world that this is set in, especially the more populated areas, feel very mysterious, very interesting, but aren't overutilized. Overall, I'd say this is one of DreamWorks' best movies. Every aspect of it just kind of works together to make a very fun, lighthearted, but also meaningful experience. Conclave is a very interesting movie. If I could compare it to anything, I'd say it has a lot of the same qualities that make 12 Angry Men a very good movie. Its plot is inherently interesting, and the way that the character dynamics and the thought processes consistently shift is very entertaining. The use of color in this film is also great. The way that this Roman cathedral is shot is always very exhilarating, and the color contrast and the symbolic imagery contrasted with the characters' often non-Christ-like actions makes it a very interesting movie, and a very interesting look at the church in general. I appreciate how it's not really talking down to the church at all, but is very much acknowledging that often the leaders are going to be flawed and less than saintly in a lot of ways. There are so many interesting character backstories and dynamics in this movie. Some of past sins that people can't escape from. Some of things that they were born with that seem to hinder them. And at the center of it all, a struggle for power in a setting that shouldn't call for that, but instead should call for humility. One of the biggest themes that I love that this movie explores is how twisted a lot of these priests get the idea of what the church's role is. Because for a lot of the movie, you as the audience realize, and eventually the character realizes, that the things that they're doing aren't really glorifying God. They forget the main purpose of why they're there, why they're doing what they're doing. It becomes eventually a system of wanting what you want instead of rather what God wants. And that's an all too common theme in so much of the church, Catholic or not. Overall, this is a very engaging character drama that's beautifully shot and has so many compelling and interesting themes that'll keep you thinking for days on end. Flow is a movie that feels like it was almost specifically made for me, and that's because of the main characters in the movie. The main characters are an all-black cat and a capybara, but it's not just the initial cuteness that sets this movie apart. It, somewhat similarly to Hundreds of Beavers, is a silent film, and the world that it creates is very interesting to live in. The animation style is very unique, setting itself apart from a similar film, The Wild Robot, in the way that the story is presented. The inciting biblical-sized apocalyptic event is also extremely interesting and well done. It's a movie about survival through the most unlikely found family. I love how expressive all of the characters are. You can tell that so much love was put into the facial work, as so much is said without any words. Thelma is a surprisingly effective and very funny comedy. Now, movies predominantly featuring grandmas as the main characters, like we saw earlier on this list, are not necessarily the best recipe for a great film. But this film knows how to use them in just the right ways. If I had to describe this movie, I'd say it's a Mission Impossible movie, except with a grandma. The stunts aren't jumping off a roof, the stunts are standing up on a bed, or almost slipping on the stairs. They are comedic in how they are portrayed, but also at the same time with such a realism where you do get genuinely a little concerned about the character. The reason that this movie is really great though, is because it has some of the most realistic and funny character dialogue between generations that I've ever seen. The movie focuses on 3 generations, the grandma at the top, and then the parents, and then the son. And all 3 of these are written very well. You can tell that a lot of it was pulled almost verbatim from real life conversations. There are so many scenarios that the son went through that I can personally relate to and have had almost the same conversation. For an example, earlier on in the film, the son is sleeping a little later than he should be, and the mom calls and gets super anxious whenever the kid doesn't pick up. Situations like that, or some of the weird things that the grandma says that you wouldn't really think but sound so realistic and familiar, make this movie both really funny, really engaging, but yet super sincere and heartwarming, because you genuinely feel like this is a real family. And you get the connection between them all immediately. Even though they may not all act in the best ways the whole time, you can tell that they really do love each other, and you do get that sense of family there. Overall, a surprisingly well shot, very realistic, and very funny movie about a grandma who goes out and tries to get her money back that was scammed from her. I don't know how that's possible, but they did it. The Fall Guy is probably one of the most fun movies that I've ever seen in my life. It's not the most deep movie, it doesn't have the best written characters, it doesn't have the most amazing action sequences ever, but all of those things work together so well and are so well made on their own that it ends up creating a package that more than anything else feels like fun. It's not a particularly deep movie, but every single scene in this flows together so well. I love the use of music in this film. The main theme by Kiss that's used sparingly throughout the whole film creates a great sense of building tension. I also love a lot of the little character details in this movie, like how Ryan Gosling and his friend constantly quote movies and try to guess what the other one is quoting. And all the action sequences in here obviously do a really good job of paying tribute to the stuntmen that work, but also become really engaging action sequences in and of themselves. They all are shot wonderfully. I love the lighting, especially in a lot of the inside sequences, and they contribute to this adrenaline rushing, very funny film that may not be that deep under the surface, but is literally so much fun that I physically can't put it any lower. It's very much a comfort film.
I saw it! It was big! It was all wiggly! And it ate everything!
That's horrible!
And now we get to the films that I would rate a 10 out of 10. And for me, a 10 out of 10 is a very rare score to give. But these next 3 films are ones that I feel like are going to stand the test of time and in a number of years be remembered as great films. That will be remembered as classics. And the first one of these is Dune Part 2. Now, I saw the first Dune a couple of times, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't really get it. There are a lot of things that I didn't really understand, especially a lot of the foreshadowing and dream stuff, but in a way that contributed to the dreamlike atmosphere that it was creating, and made it all the more engaging for me. And then I saw Dune Part 2, and I didn't really fully get it at first. But again, it was such a well-made and fun movie that I enjoyed it a lot. But then after watching Dune 2, I went back and watched Dune 1, and I finally understood it. It still had that great dreamlike quality to it, but I was able to appreciate so much better the character motivations and the general plot that it was shaping up. And then right after that, I went back to the theater and watched Dune Part 2 and realized how great of a movie this really is. The directing in this movie is absolutely fantastic. Pretty much every shot in this film is a masterpiece. The use of orange is used so well in this movie, and the desert is used to create so many interesting and diverse shots. The action is thoroughly engaging, and the character motivations, though sometimes a little more difficult to stomach, are all done superbly. The acting is great, the direction is great, the coloring is great, everything about this movie is fantastic. But probably my favorite aspect of it was some of the sequences on the sandworms. Watching this in the theater and feeling the bass while Paul was riding on a sandworm was an amazing experience. It engages you so much in the scene and feels all the more impactful whenever Paul finally does accomplish this challenge. Very, very satisfying sequel. I'm not sure how Dune Messiah is going to compare to this whenever it comes out, but as for now, at least we have two amazing adaptations of this great series.
I want to take a little trip somewhere, yeah, places I've never been, yeah, going on a tour without a care.
Now, if there are two things that I value more than anything else while watching a film, it's these: characters and comedy. Now, these two elements don't objectively make the best films, but for me personally, if a movie is going to excel at these two things, then it's probably going to be a movie that I enjoy. I say all that partially to justify this ranking, but also to get a little in my headspace about how I view movies. A Real Pain is a small indie comedy directed and starring Jesse Eisenberg. It's a small little movie about a couple of cousins who go on this road trip. Think the Darjeeling Limited, but with Wallace Wells from Scott Pilgrim, and then Jesse Eisenberg playing Jesse Eisenberg. The reason that this movie works so well is because A, it's a really funny movie, and B, has some of the most compelling character drama that I've seen in a long time. This movie covers a very specific dynamic between the two cousins that I'm not going to spoil, that though I have not personally lived through, I've seen it in a few different people, and this movie does an amazing portrayal of how that plays out. One isn't necessarily better than the other. There's jealousy between both of them. The characters love each other, but they hate each other in very contrasting ways. It's a movie that thrives on those character interactions. But beyond the characters and comedy, this is a very well-directed movie. The way that Poland is shot in here is very catching to the eye and very engaging. Scenes like the ones on the train make a place that could be very mundane seem all the more interesting and engaging. Overall, a very impressive movie. Not just because it's very fun and funny, but also because it has very well-written characters and a dynamic that I haven't seen explored that much in film. And it surprisingly ended up becoming one of my favorites of the year. And my favorite movie of 2024 is Perfect Days. Now, this one might be a little bit of cheating because technically in a lot of regions this movie was released in 2023, but for America, a majority of people didn't have access to it till 2024, so I'm counting this just for the technicalities of this list. Perfect Days is a very slow, subtle, and methodical movie. It's again one that emphasizes a lot on the characters. Specifically the protagonist, who is a virtually silent old man working at a Tokyo toilet cleaning company. We follow him as he goes through his mundane but very interesting day, getting ready for work, cleaning his house, working his job, trying to unwind afterwards. It's a very mesmerizing film as we're just following a simple man on his simple days. The reason that this one is my favorite is because the way that the main character is portrayed is so subtly, deeply interesting. We get to experience the joys of life right beside him. The joys of living in a place that you love. The joys of listening to music day to day. The sense of accomplishment that you can get through doing a simple task very well. He's such a likable character that is portrayed to perfection. The cinematography in this is also gorgeous. The way that Tokyo is shot, even the places that wouldn't be as interesting or nice to look at, are shown in such an interesting light. Overall, Perfect Days is my favorite movie of 2024. It's got amazing characters, amazing acting, amazing cinematography, amazing songs. Overall, just a mesmerizing picture that I'll be watching for years to come. And that was my list of the 100 movies that I saw in 2024. If you stuck around this far, I am so sorry. Hopefully my voice didn't annoy you too much. Hopefully my repetitive opinions didn't annoy you too much. And if you're interested in engaging, down below you can comment what some of your favorite and least favorite films were this year. Until next time, thanks for watching.